These bike stems look insane. Seriously, 0 millimeters. According to Analog Cycles, the 0 millimeter Discord creamy stem helps riders to achieve a higher and shorter cockpit than typical, and there is no doubt about that. But what about the twitchiness of the steering? After experimenting with 0 millimeter bike stems for a while, the guys at Analog Cycles say the difference in twitchiness is negligible. Today, we're going to run the numbers and find out how short stems affect the steering twitchiness, and I think you'll be really surprised by the results. But first, a deep dive into the role of stems. The stem on a bicycle is part of a steering system, and there are many aspects which affect the steering feel. These include your handlebar design, head tube angle, fork offset, trail, tyre width, and whether you're carrying any luggage on the front of your bike. Arguably, the most important feature of a stem is that it positions your body in an optimised location between your wheels for the type of riding you do. That's going to be different depending on the purpose of your bike. I recently discussed the optimal weight distribution in my frame geometry masterclass. Make sure to check out that video once you're finished here. In short, bicycle fit is key here, and different frames have been optimised around a somewhat narrow range of handlebar widths and stem lengths. When we isolate other variables, there are 3 different measurements at the cockpit that tell us the most information about how the steering will feel. The first is the width of your hands from the steering axis. The wider this distance is, the more steering leverage you will achieve, requiring less upper body force to change the direction of your bike. Steering leverage is particularly important for a bike with front luggage, as it will help you move multiple kilograms around the steering arc. The second is the distance your hands need to move when turning the bars. The shorter this displacement is, the more twitchy your steering will become. This just means that less steering input is required to change the direction of your bike. And the third is the location of your hands on the steering arc. Different bikes have different steering zones. These zones are the section of the steering arc that your hands travel along when changing the direction of your bike. It's hard to definitively place an ideal steering zone because that all depends on the other aspects of the steering. On most bikes, we want our hands to travel in the upper half of the steering arc, in front of the steering axis. We apply a forward force on our grips when we ride. Steering in the upper half of this arc allows our bars to always self-center, as we're actually working against this forward pressure when we turn our bars. This self-centering is particularly important when you're slowing down, as a bike that cannot self-center under braking will pull the front wheel to the left or right. A cruiser or Dutch bike is the exception here, but given there is very little forward force on the grips, these bikes usually handle just fine. However, it's worth noting that the steering zones on these bikes are more a function of the overall bike design. Right. Let's talk about how stem length can stabilise your steering. A shorter stem offers a more direct or neutral steering, as there is less left to right movement along the steering arc. This is nice because you can be a bit more intentional with the location of your centre of mass. The downside is that forces coming from the ground have a larger effect on the steering. That said, adding steering leverage to a bike by fitting wider handlebars will counter most of these forces. In comparison, a longer stem offers more side-to-side movement on the steering arc. The result is more stabilisation from ground forces, which is usually better with narrow handlebar bikes on softer surfaces like sand. So, how does stem length affect steering speed? I've run the displacement numbers on 5 different handlebars to see how stem lengths change the twitchiness of the bike. Turn a Ritchey VentureMax drop bar by 20 degrees and the 50mm stem will be 10% more twitchy and the 0mm stem 17% more twitchy. Turn a VentureMax XL drop bar and the 50mm stem will be 8% more twitchy and the 0mm stem 14% more twitchy. Turn a Curve Walmer drop bar and the 50mm stem will be 6% more twitchy and the 0mm stem 10% more twitchy. Turn a Ritchey Comp flat bar and the 50mm stem will be 3.2% more twitchy and the 0mm stem 3.6% more twitchy. Okay, let's make sense of these numbers. When using narrow handlebars with a short stem, there will be much bigger changes to the twitchiness of the steering than if you use a wide handlebar. The extreme case of switching from a 100mm stem to a 0mm stem will result in 17% more twitchiness, which is a lot. But if you're switching from a 50mm to a 0mm stem on a flat bar bike, the difference will be almost impossible to detect. In general, I suspect displacement differences of less than 5% will likely go unnoticed. But here's an interesting case. If you use a swept back handlebar like the Koga Denim bar, you will actually make your bike more twitchy with a longer stem. That's because the effective stem length is only positive once the stem hits 75mm, which is an important consideration when you're fitting a swept back bar to your bike. Okay, so who needs a 0mm stem? A 0mm stem is going to be best used on a bike with 1. Slow steering characteristics, and 2. A handlebar with very little backsweep. In other words, pair it with a wide drop bar or an alt handlebar like the forward-reaching Surly Moloko. A good use case might be a mountain bike frame paired with wide drop bars. Mountain bikes already have slow steering, so the slight increase in twitchiness will be largely offset. Mountain bike frames are also often 50mm longer than a drop bar frame, so a 0mm stem will help claw back some of this reach. Another use case might be to achieve a more upright bike fit on your current bike. The Discord Creamy stem will increase the stack by about 80mm, along with bringing the bars closer to your body. As long as you're already using a wide handlebar, this short stem will not change the twitchiness of your steering by a whole lot. Okay, so where are we at with short stems? If you switch from a 50mm to 0mm stem, you'll probably not notice any twitchiness difference when using a flat bar, but you will notice the extra twitchiness with narrow drop bars. That said, bikes have been designed around an intended use, which is optimised around bike stems in a certain length range. I, first and foremost, recommend finding a bike that is the right fit so that you can match the stem length with the rest of the steering characteristics. If you're looking to hack a bike that's technically too long, fit drop bars to a mountain bike, or achieve a shorter and higher handlebar setup, a short stem is not as crazy as it sounds. Also, try to make sure your hands are in front of the steering axis, so you can take advantage of the extra stabilisation of steering in the upper half of the steering arc. If you're still here, you're probably a massive bike nerd like me. If you want more bike nerd content, hit that subscribe button and consider supporting my work on Patreon. I put an insane amount of work into each of these videos, and many of the things I describe will not be found anywhere else. That's a pretty cool mission to support, don't you think?